I have been defending doctors and hospitals in medical malpractice cases for over 20 years. I am their advocate. In a minute, I'm going to tell you some stories about those 20 years, but one thing I know from talking to juries for 20 years is that right after lunch, people get a little sleepy. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but one way to stop you from getting sleepy that I'm not allowed to do with the jury is to do a little exercise. And this exercise, I believe that you will take home and you'll want to play with your kids and your family and your wives and your husbands. So very quickly, I'm going to ask you to look at the person next to you. Snap with your dominant hand 5 times, and then draw a capital E on your forehead. Ready? Go. Okay. Did you draw the capital E facing yourself, or did you draw the capital E facing the person you were looking at? How many faced the person they were looking at? How many faced themselves? You're all jerks. No, not really. So this E-test is something that I read in Daniel Pink's book, To Sell is Human. And it's not his. He took it from psychologists. And psychologists use this test to see whether or not in the moment you're thinking more of yourself or you're thinking more of the person that you're talking to or working with. Now, it is not that you are a jerk if you drew the E facing you. It just means that in this moment, you're thinking more of yourself. It's funny because when I read the book, I was on vacation with my mother and my sister. So of course, immediately I was like, snap 5 times and draw an E in your forehead. My mom faced me. My sister faced herself. The rest of the vacation, she was the selfish jerk. But I found something really interesting. Just last week, I had the opportunity to go see Daniel Pink speak. And before I was early, so I was sitting at the bar talking to the bartenders, and there were 3 of them working. 2 were coming on to work, and 1 was leaving work. And I asked them to do it. And the one who was leaving work to go home and tend to his own business drew the E facing himself. And the ones who were coming on to deal with customers drew the E facing me. And I think maybe that's the point, that you can choose what you're thinking of. You can choose how to draw the E. And I would urge you to urge the people you work with and yourselves to at least think about how you're drawing that E when you are going into your day and your interactions, because I believe it will make you a better partner, a better friend, a better doctor, and definitely a better advocate. I also believe it will help you to avoid lawsuits, like this one. What I remember most about this case was the stairs. They were narrow and steep, and they were dark. And it was the first time I had to go to a patient's house to take their deposition. This case, this man was dying of cancer. He couldn't leave his house. And because he was dying of cancer, I had to go into his house to ask him about what happened, because he claimed that my doctor had failed to diagnose cancer. He said that because of that failure to diagnose cancer, he was now dying. So I had to climb those stairs, step into his home, and ask him about his pain, about his complaints, and about his conversation with my doctor. But I also had to step into his home and challenge him, because I believed that his failure to follow up on my doctor's recommendation had led to the fact that he was now sitting in that hospital bed. You see, in the patient portal, my doctor had recommended that this patient get an MRI, and he had never done so. And part of our claim was that had the MRI been done, it would have helped the doctor to diagnose this cancer. So I walked up those stairs and got into the room, and his hospital bed was set up in the kitchen because there was no room in this small Philadelphia row home for any other place for the hospital bed. There was nowhere for me to sit, and I didn't want to sit on his bed and ask him questions, so I stood the whole time, and it was about a 3-hour deposition, and he went through his pain, his suffering, his worry about his family after he would be gone, the conversations that he had with my doctor, and then finally I had the opportunity to challenge him and say, "Sir, why didn't you get the MRI that the doctor recommended in the patient portal?" His answer, "I didn't know what it was. I had had an X-ray, and I thought they were the same thing. I didn't want to have to leave my home again to get another test, and I didn't want to pay another copay. And I said, "Sir, why didn't you ask the doctor what it was?" And he said, "I was embarrassed. I didn't know who else was looking in the patient portal, who else might see that I don't know what an MRI was, so I just didn't ask." I believe that that case could have been avoided if that man had better advocated for himself and if that doctor had better advocated for his patient. So I want to talk to you about advocacy, because ultimately advocacy is simply being on someone's side. I'm on your side. Those are such powerful words. I didn't used to know the power of those words, "I'm on your side." I thought that they went without saying. I wouldn't say them to my doctors when I first met them. But doctors are human, and when they are sued, they are confused, they're frustrated, they're scared, and they're vulnerable. And they need to hear that I'm on their side. When I say those words, their shoulders drop, no more shoulders like earrings. Their eyes light up, and then we can get to work. Now, when I say I'm on your side, it doesn't mean that I believe they did everything right. What it does mean is that I am going to work really hard to listen to them and to understand them. I am going to fight for them when necessary, and I am going to advocate for them. I want you to walk away today being on your own side and the side of the people that you care about, including your patients, your team, and your families. And I know that these 5 C's of advocacies will help you to do that. Compassion, connection, creativity, curiosity, and credibility. So let's talk about compassion first, because that may be the basis of all advocacy. And the EMR makes it harder to be compassionate. Technology makes it harder to be compassionate. As you'll see in this text message, this father wasn't very compassionate with his daughter. No compassion there. Come on, Dad. I bet he wouldn't have done that in person. The thing with the electronic medical record is it can help, but it can hurt. You know, I love the story of the Christmas time truce during World War I. I'm sure that some of you have heard this, that during World War I, at Christmas time, the Germans and the Allies, for a short while, put down their weapons, came together, and played soccer. They sang together. And there's a lot of discussions with historians about how this could happen. And one of the ways that they believe that this happened is these enemies weren't fighting from far away. For weeks, they had been feet apart in the trenches on the Western Front. They had heard each other's voices, and we'll talk about that. They could see each other. There was physical proximity enough that they grew a connection that allowed them to have this truce. I don't believe that could happen today when we fight war with drones from far away. We practice medicine from far away too, a lot of times. So we need to be really careful to overcome this far apart relationship and bring it a little bit closer, because proximity wins cases. I recently tried a case that we ultimately won. It was a very long case, very hard fought, and the jury was out for 3 full days, which is a long time. It's a really long time when you're waiting, but it's a long time. And ultimately they found for my doctor, and they wanted to talk to her afterwards. And the reason they wanted to talk to her is because almost every one of them said, "You sat on her bed." She had described, and the patient had described, that when she first came in, she sat on the patient's bed to have a conversation with her. And the jury remembered that. Because, guys, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. There is no correlation. This is so frustrating but true. No correlation between negligence and lawsuits. And at the end of this, if you want any of the studies that I talk about today, I'm happy to send them to you. The New England Journal of Medicine and Harvard have found no correlation between negligence and lawsuits. The correlation is between communication and lawsuits. Compassionate communication, I would add. The person who's done the most research on this, in my opinion, is a woman named Wendy Levinson. She's done a lot of research, and some of it is actually cited in the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, where they talk about tone of voice, which I'm going to come back to again and again because it's that important. But they found that doctors who were not sued were more likely to make statements of orientation. I am going to touch you now. They were more likely also to touch appropriately. They were more likely to use laughter and humor, and they were more likely to use their listening skills. I bet those doctors drew the E facing outwards on the days that they were dealing with these patients. Compassion is one of the bedrocks of strong advocacy. The next is connection. And we talked about the fact that the EMR can make it hard to be connected, but it can also help. We act like the electronic medical record is the enemy, and it is not. It can be used in so many ways to make things more efficient and connected between doctor and patient. I love scribes. I love when a doctor dictates the note in front of the patient so that the patient hears it, and also dictates that they dictated the note in front of the patient so the jury sees that the patient heard it. That's helpful. It also allows for eye-to-eye contact while the doctor is dictating that note. If they insist on using the computer, I'd prefer that they keep eye-to-eye from the patient with the computer between them. These connections are vitally important. But it's not just connections like this. It has to also be meetings of the minds and hearts in order for there to be true connections. The biggest hurdle in medicine, in my opinion, for there to be a connection of the minds and hearts is the curse of knowledge. How many of you know what the curse of knowledge is? A couple of you. The best way to show you the curse of knowledge is by playing the game Name That Tune. So what am I humming? Okay. That's a really frustrating game for me. I'm in front of 300 people who I don't know, humming, looking like a little bit of a dork. But it's also frustrating because I know what I'm humming. I have the curse of knowledge. It's really hard for me to get myself in your head and imagine what it's like not to know. Doctors, every one of you, doctor or not, anyone who works in the healthcare profession has the curse of knowledge about medicine. The doctor had the curse of knowledge about what an MRI was. That's the curse of knowledge at work. I am always blown away when I see attorneys get up in their openings in Philadelphia County, where the juries oftentimes are not highly educated, and they're talking about osteomyelitis and vascular surgery. These jurors don't know what we're talking about. I get up and say, bone infection, blood doctor. I do my best to overcome the curse of knowledge so that I can advocate for my client. And you can do the same. You can overcome the curse of knowledge with a little bit of forethought and a little bit of consideration about what the person on the other end of your information is hearing from you. Because connections, you know this, the studies are just abounding right now about social isolation and the fact that social isolation is probably more unhealthy than obesity and smoking and high blood pressure. But the opposite is also true, that when we're connected, we are healthier. There's a study that shows that if you stand at the base of a hill with someone that you know and trust, and you look up at that hill, you see the hill as less steep. If that hill is a deathly diagnosis, and your patient feels like you are standing there hand in hand, they will see what they need to do to overcome that diagnosis as less of a challenge. And for you healthcare providers, you need compassion too. You need connection too. I sat here and watched this morning Kevin, the ER doctor, talk about horrible things and all of that blood, and we don't talk about the fact that that has to impact healthcare providers. It does. And one of the things that we know for sure is that difficult patients who are psychologically challenging, and they're out there, those patients make it more likely that they're going to have a misdiagnosis. I haven't tried that in defense yet in a case, but it's true. If you have a difficult patient, studies show that it takes away the psychological resources that you need, and then you're more likely to misdiagnose those patients. And happy doctors make better diagnoses and are more creative in their practice. In that particular study, they gave the doctors a bunch of candy in the morning, and they found that at the end of the day, those doctors made better diagnoses and were more creative. So when we're talking about these 5 C's, it's not just towards your patient or towards your team members. It's for everyone, including the healthcare providers. The next C is creativity, and this is an area where AI and technology and computers cannot be as good as you when it comes to advocacy. These are the names, paint names, that AI came up with, and I just think that they're absolutely fabulous. We've got Dundarf, which is a lovely color. We've got Snyder Brown. And then what I thought was really interesting and perhaps indicative of who came up with these names or made the AI that came up with these names, we've got Dope and we've got Stoner Blue. These are the names that artificial intelligence comes up with because artificial intelligence doesn't have any creativity. But if you want to connect with people, whether it be people at home or people at work, if you want to advocate for your ideas and what you stand for and yourself, if you want to set boundaries and you want to overcome objections, you need to be creative in doing so. We lawyers often say that we have to say things 7 times, 7 ways for the jury to get it. That's hard. Opening, closing, expert witness, defendant doctor, piece of video, medical record, and maybe some sort of audio. If you doctors or healthcare providers want to get something across to patients, 7 times 7 ways can be hard. In person, by text, do some sort of video, make it on paper, have the nurse tell them, leave them a text message. It's difficult. It takes creativity to do. You know, there's a woman who showed so much of all 5 of the C's that I use her in almost every one of my talks. As one of my jobs, I am an anchor at the Law and Crime Network, which is Dan Abrams' streaming court TV type of thing. And a few months ago, we streamed the Larry Nassar case. That's that terrible doctor in Michigan. Like everybody's nodding their head. It was horrible. I have to tell you, sitting through 2 weeks of those strong women talking about the atrocities was hard for me. I couldn't get over the judge. Amazing. She's in my book. You guys got the book, which I think I'm so excited about. She's in the book. She's been on my podcast. If you want to hear her episode, the podcast is also called The Elegant Warrior. She's just amazing. But she was creative in the way that she talked to the women who came up in front of her. Originally, only about 50 women intended to testify, and most of them did not intend to give their names or let their faces be shown. By the end of the hearing, every day more women were coming forward until more than 150 ultimately came forward to tell their stories. And I believe it's in large part because of the creative way that she asked this question. She didn't say to each woman, "What do you want to say?" She didn't say, "What do you have to tell me?" She didn't say, "Tell me what I need to know." She said to each woman, and it still gives me goosebumps, "Tell me what you want me to know." So different. If doctors said that to every patient, it would change things. It might slow things down, and we know that efficiency is a problem, but it would change things. If you say that to your significant other when you're in the middle of a fight, it might change things. The way that she worded that, I asked her, "How did you know to do that?" She had no good answer. I think it just comes naturally. I bet she draws her E facing outward. But she is creative in the way that she worded those questions. Now, what do you see here? I wish it didn't say what they were at the bottom. I tried to get it off and I couldn't. But, you see both, right? Because it tells you to see both. I wonder what you'd see if it didn't say it. But the point is that you don't know what the other person is seeing. You don't know what the other person is hearing. Creativity can help you with that. When I give these talks, I used to use the Yanni and Laurel. Do you remember that in the news? The reason I don't use that anymore is because when you play it in an auditorium, it loses its impact, so not as many people are separated. It's all in the tone, again, back with tone. But the point is that you don't know. It's really scary for an attorney. If I don't know what the jury's hearing, I'm in trouble. But one of the things I have to do is be creative, put myself in their head, ask them questions during jury selection to help me understand what they might be hearing and seeing. That creativity will help all of you be better advocates. And now curiosity. Curiosity is probably my favorite of all of the C's because I just think it's so much fun to be curious. One of the ideals of curiosity is asking questions. Questions are a funny thing. When I tell people I'm a trial attorney, oftentimes they'll say, oh, I should have been an attorney because I really like to argue. And I always say to them, the only time I get to argue in a trial is during closings. Openings are supposed to be a statement, not argument. And then during closings, that's the argument, and that's a small fraction of the case. But the majority of the case is actually questions. Questions of my witnesses to urge the jury to see things their way. Questions of opposing witnesses to challenge their version of the truth. That is the way that we are able to win cases, not by arguing. And curiosity is really interesting. Had that patient asked the question, what is an MRI, we may not have been standing in that kitchen. Had the doctor asked the patient, do you have any questions? Do you know what an MRI is? Do you understand why you need this? We may not have been standing in that kitchen. And there are so many studies. I belong to this book club called the Next Big Idea Book Club. Highly recommend it. The books are curated by Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink. And you get 2 books a quarter, and the books are always interesting books that I may not have heard of, and then we all talk about them online and sometimes in person. There are, I know, chapters in the Philadelphia area. But almost every book has a part on curiosity. And there are tons of studies that show that the more questions you ask, the more people like you, the smarter they think you are. And in fact, there's actually a study that shows for those single people out there that in speed dating, the people who asked the most questions got the most second dates. Because people want to be asked. They want to feel smart. They want to feel like you're interested. So if you want to be a strong advocate for yourself, for your business, for your ideas, I urge you to ask more questions. Now, that includes asking questions not just of your patients, but also of everyone on the healthcare team. How many of you are familiar with Atul Gawande? Atul Gawande has some fabulous books about medicine, and he is now with Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett starting up that new healthcare endeavor. I went to see him speak on this recently, and it's going to be really interesting to see what they do. I think a lot of it will be based on the Checklist Manifesto, which is one of his books. If you haven't read it, I recommend you do. It's a lot of what we've talked about already today about systems and putting systems in place. Putting those systems in place allows for creativity, connection, compassion, credibility, and curiosity. But one of the things that Atul Gawande has talked about is a study that he did that showed that if everyone in the operating room knows everyone else's names, complications fall by 35%. I have to be honest, when I first heard that, I was like, what is wrong with these people? How can they not know each other's names? But I was a hypocrite, because when I walk around my office, I don't always know every paralegal's names. I'm on trial, they come in. Do I have time to introduce myself? Maybe not. That is not fair, and it's not going to make for a psychologically safe workplace. Curiosity has to extend to curiosity about the people that you work with, and that starts with asking their names. Atul Gawande believes that the reason for that fall in complications is once you say, what's your name, you've now given the person psychological permission to speak. So when they see you operating on the wrong leg or hanging the wrong medication, they're more likely to speak up. Now, Amy Edmondson is a researcher at Harvard, and she's done a lot of research on what makes for strong teams. And she's the one that came up with 2 out of the 3 on this Venn diagram. She says that strong teams are made out of proportionate speaking. Everyone on the team speaks about the same amount as anyone else. And that, I think, is founded in curiosity. And then intuition is the other one that Amy Edmondson speaks about. Intuition is that idea that I know what you're thinking. I know what you're feeling. My E faces you. I know where you're coming from. Now, I've added proportionate listening to this diagram because I think, how safe can you feel if you're speaking and no one's listening to you? So as we talk about advocacy, advocacy isn't just about speaking. I like to speak. But advocacy is also about listening, and listening with your phone down and your eyes and your ears and your emotions to really hear tone of voice. Now, I could talk about tone of voice all day. I think tone of voice is an underrated thing. There are studies that show that you can understand and learn more from someone else's emotions by their tone of voice than all the other senses combined. So I urge you, if you want to be a strong advocate, to be really tuned in to other people's tones of voice and your own. Listen with curiosity to tone of voice. You know, when I read that study about tone of voice and being able to read people's emotions, I started doing, during workshops, exercises with blindfolds. And I would have one person blindfold themselves and the other person not, and then say certain things in different tones of voice, and the person with the blindfold would have to guess. When I've done this exercise with CEOs and doctors, they're not so good at it. When I do this exercise with customer phone call center agents, they look at me like I'm a moron. Like, who can't figure this out? Because they listen all day. They hear tone of voice all day. Tone of voice is a practice, and if you're curious about it, you can get better. And there's all kinds of cool stuff about tone of voice. A woman's tone of voice grows plants faster than a man's does. We know that women's tones, somebody doesn't like that. We know that women's tones of voice also tend to be better at making babies feel more comfortable. But your tone of voice is like your fingerprint. No one has the same tone of voice as you do. And I urge you to own your voice, to use your voice, to advocate with your voice, because if you don't say what you need to say, no one else is going to say it. If you don't speak up, asking questions with curiosity, showing your compassion, and objecting when necessary, no one else is going to do it. And sometimes your voice is the thing about you that is different enough to make a difference. I'll give you an example. This summer, I tried a case, and it was a long case, and it was a case with a lot of curse of knowledge problems. The case was a failure to diagnose this very unusual skin disease, and the patient had sued 4 doctors. The patient himself was a middle-aged man. His attorney was a middle-aged man. All 4 of the doctors were middle-aged men. 3 of their attorneys were middle-aged men. The judge was a middle-aged man. And then there was me. And the case was going into its second week, and an expert was on the stand talking about the growth of this disease. And the way that this disease grows, it's something to do with math and pi. I became a lawyer because I don't like math, and I never understood pi. And when the expert was talking to the jury about pi, I knew they were thinking the same thing I was, which was like apple, key lime. I don't know, he's drawing numbers on the easel. And here's where we get to the after lunch problem, because the jurors were falling asleep. This happens all the time. People are shocked by this, but it happens all the time. I see some attorneys who I've tried cases with in the room, and we know that this happens. And when it does happen, the court crier will go up to the person who's sleeping and hand them a glass of water to gently wake them up. So in this particular case, the jury was sleeping a lot, but every time I got up, they would wake up just for a minute. It wasn't because it was Heather Hansen. It wasn't because I was saying anything special. It was because I sounded different. My differences were my strength in that case. There is not one of you that doesn't have a difference that you can use as your strength. I urge you to use your voices, find your differences, and take advantage of them as you advocate for people and yourself. The last C is probably the most important C, even if it's not the most fun. That is credibility. Because you cannot advocate if you are not credible. I will not win my cases if the jurors don't find me credible. I have to, from the first day I step into the courtroom, I have to set expectations and meet them. I have to make promises and keep them. And if you're ever a juror on one of my cases, you might hear me say, It is not enough, ladies and gentlemen, for them to say it. They have to prove it. Credibility. It is not enough for you to say that you care, that you're compassionate, that you're curious, that you want to be connected. You have to prove it. And one of the expectations that people have, especially in healthcare, is that you have some empathy, that you want to know what they are going through. And the unfortunate truth is that power causes brain damage. There are studies of MRIs of the brain of people in power. Some might say this explains what's going on with our president. There are studies that show that when you're in power, you become more impulsive. You become less risk averse, but most importantly, you become so much less empathetic. That E-test, this is from an Atlantic Journal article, which cites to some studies, and that E-test, the people in positions of power almost always face the E towards themselves. So that empathy is a piece of credibility because that's an expectation people have. And if you don't meet that expectation, then you are not going to be found credible and you're not going to be able to advocate as well. I asked Allie and Maureen to let me add this slide late because this study just blew my mind and I keep talking about it to people in depositions, so I had to share it with you. To grow that empathy, to help you with that empathy, you need to look at each other. So this is a study of radiologists. These radiologists were given a bunch of CAT scans, and they were given the CAT scans with a picture of the patient's face. Those radiologists then wrote their reports with lots of incidental findings. 3 months later, same radiologists, same CAT scans, no picture, 80% less incidental findings. Is that amazing? Why don't we always have the picture? That is part of credibility, is the idea that patients, when they step into a doctor's office, they think everyone, and I work with not just doctors in working on these communication skills, but I work with the people at the front desk, the surgery schedulers, the call center people, because they expect that empathy from everyone across the line. And so you have to work with everybody and make sure that everyone on the team feels cared for as well. But if you can make those connections like that, you can improve healthcare and you can improve how happy people are, and you can improve trust. Another book I highly recommend is Dr. Haley Fisher Wright, Back to Balance. She's a doctor that writes almost completely about the relationships between doctors and patients. And she takes the position, and she has a study that backs up each one of these, that when there's more trust between doctor and patient, diabetes is more likely to be controlled, cholesterol is more likely to be lowered, preventative care goes up, anxiety goes down, lower readmissions, so now we're talking about the bottom line, lower costs, bottom line, and higher patient satisfaction scores. Again, the bottom line. And I'm going to come back to the bottom line in a minute, because ROI we know is important. Another study that I love, so I'm a psychology major. I probably never should have been a lawyer because I like this stuff so much better. But I always loved placebo studies because I just thought it was so interesting that someone could take a sugar pill and get better. And there's a placebo study that I love. It was in Japan. They could never do it here because the lawyers wouldn't let them. 13 patients, that's all, who are very allergic to poison ivy. Doctors that they trusted told them, this is poison ivy, and rubbed it on their arm. It wasn't poison ivy. All 13 broke out. Amazing. Same group. Doctor said, this isn't poison ivy. This is where the lawyers come in. Rubbed it on their arm. Only 2 broke out in hives. That's the power of trust. Placebos don't work if you don't trust the doctor. If some rando comes up and gives you a sugar pill, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, that's going to make me better. You have to trust the doctor who's giving you the sugar pill. That is how valuable trust can be. It's an amazing asset, but it's hard to grow. It takes time and creativity and compassion and connection to build that trust. So there is a gentleman, a doctor, named Dr. Joseph Ravenel. He's got a great TED Talk. I highly recommend it. He's a doctor who found that African American men had a terrible problem with high blood pressure. We know that, right? And they were not going to their doctors. They were not compliant. It was a huge problem. And Joseph Ravenel connected that these African American men were spending tons of time at their barbershop. And they were connecting with their barbers. And they trusted their barbers. So he decided to train the barbers on how to tell people about high blood pressure, how to take blood pressures, and how to give them instructions on how to avoid high blood pressure problems. And those people's blood pressure came down. I think it was 20%. I'll have to look at the study again. That's the value of trust and connection and advocating for yourself and the people you care about. It is huge. And to get back to that bottom line, so when I started doing speaking, it was mainly to audiences like you, healthcare providers. That's where my background is. But now I'm getting more and more requests, because this is all just communication, for customer experience talks, people in retail, people who are customer experience officers, because they see that ideally, in the best of all worlds, you want to make your customers into your advocates. And isn't that true in healthcare? If your patients are your advocates, then you're going to get more referrals, right? So in customer service, in customer experience, and now more than ever, medicine is seeing patients as customers. We see that many hospitals are bringing in the writs to show them how to treat patients like customers. Customers, that 1% of customers are the people who will go out and spread the word. They will advocate for you, and they will bring people in. So for these groups, does anyone know who fanboys advocate for? Apple. This is the name for the people who are Apple crazies. The Bayhive, come on. Beyonce, right. Anyone know who Cheerios are? Ed Sheeran? They love Ed Sheeran. Cheeseheads? What about AFOLs? Anyone know what they are? Adult fans of Legos. And then Maxinistas, come on. TJ Maxx. Can you imagine if there was a group of patients that's like, I'm a Jeffersonista? But it can happen. It can happen. You just have to be focused on advocacy and connection and compassion and curiosity and credibility, and you can build a group of advocates who are then going out there and spreading the word for you. The way I know it can happen is because of a case that I had that illustrates this better than anything else possibly could. I represented a doctor who is wonderful, smart. He's not that. Those paint names are in my head. Wonderful, smart, funny, charismatic, but during office hours, he's rushed, he's busy, he doesn't have a lot of time. He did a surgery, an orthopedic surgery on, and by the way, I have his permission to tell this story, even though I'm not going to tell you his name, because he loves the story. He did a surgery on a patient, and the patient ended up with a leg length discrepancy. Recognized risk, right? Recognized complication of a total hip replacement, which is what that surgery was. But the patient claimed that it was the result of negligence. So here we go, we're going to trial. And this case happened in a courtroom that was very, very small. The patient had moved away to Colorado, so she had flown back in for a week and a half or so of trial. And the courtroom was so small that the table for defense counsel was right next to the table for plaintiff's counsel. And then I was sitting at the table for defense counsel with all of my documents, which are like my blood during trial, sitting to my left. So my doctor sat to my right. The patient's attorney's over here with his documents all next to him, so his client, the patient herself, to his left. What does that mean? Our clients are touching knees for 2 weeks, a week and a half. Now, as I said, the woman had come back into town. Every morning, my doctor would get there just a little bit before me, and I'd always try to race him because I didn't want to see what I was seeing, which was walking into the courtroom, and my doctor's just chatting it up with the plaintiff. Right? And I'd be like, what are you doing? And stop. And he was like, oh, I'm just, she wanted to know about restaurants and what they're going to do this weekend. And okay. So, building a connection, right? Showing some compassion, being curious. And then we put on our case. Cross-examined witnesses, built credibility, showed some curiosity, bit by bit by bit. The doctor finally got up to testify, and he turned to the jury, but he also looked at the patient intermittently as he described what he did and why he did it. Compassion, curiosity, connection, creativity, credibility. And at the end of the case, the jury found for the doctor. And as I was packing up my precious papers, I looked over, and the doctor's talking to the patient. But at this point, I don't care. We won. Who cares? He can do whatever he wants now. But he's writing something down. So he and I walked out to our car, and I said, "Doctor, what were you writing down for that patient?" And he said, nonchalant as heck, "Oh, she wanted to know if she could refer her sister and her friend to me." And he said, "Yes." So he was giving her his cell phone number. Compassion, creativity, credibility, curiosity, and connection had turned that woman from an adversary to an advocate. It works. Full stop. I am thrilled. This book came out last week. It is a labor of love for me. It's about stories from the courtroom and lessons from the courtroom that apply to life, and I am so grateful that the people at CASAD have provided it to you. And the only reason I want to bring it up now is because it contains another C. So when I've done interviews about the book, everyone says, "Why the elegant warrior?" The word elegant comes from the Latin root to choose. That's another C word. I believe that you choose your elegance. You decide what it means to you. It might be lipstick and earrings. It might be yoga pants and sneakers. It might be a t-shirt and Converse. It might be a football uniform. The challenge becomes that during times of trial, how do you stay true to that elegance while you fight your battles? It's a choice. Perspective is a choice. All 5 C's of the choice. How you draw that E is a choice. But ultimately, I hope that you walk away today choosing to advocate for yourself and others in a little bit of a different way. I'm happy to answer your questions. If you don't have questions, you get a long break.
I have 2 questions. The first is, you elegantly described the 5 C's and how we should use that, not just in how we deal with our patients, but probably in life.
Yeah.
The question is that every once in a while you're in a situation where that doesn't work. And this may be a talk in and of itself, is how do you deal with a difficult patient or where the chemistry is not right, or you just know you're not getting through and the 5 C's aren't working. The second question is what was the tune you were humming?
What was the what?
The tune you were humming?
Oh, We Are the Champions. I didn't tell you. I started humming that tune right after the Eagles won the Super Bowl, so a little bit ago. And then it just stuck because it's one that's often guessed. Your question is a great one, and it is another talk. Because, I'm sorry. The question was, you can't always be elegant. Let's face facts, right? And that's one of the things, and I'm not going to give away what's in the book, but that's one of the challenges, because my job is to be a warrior. My job isn't to be elegant. No one cares if I'm elegant. They care if I win. And lawsuits are a little bit different than most of what you guys deal with, because they're a zero-sum game. Someone wins and someone loses all the time. There's no win-win situation when you get to trial and you go in front of a jury. So I believe that sometimes you have to choose the warrior. I talk in the book about if someone gets dirty, sometimes you have to get dirty. But it has to be a decision and not a response and not a reaction. For me, it has to be, and one of the things that allows me to do that is preparation. Like really preparing for that fight when I know that I have to have it. And the other thing that is really important to me is, I talk about this in the book, honoring dignity. I will steal the patient's story and their version of the truth on cross-examination if I'm doing my job well, but I will never steal their dignity. And I think that you can get into fights and you can win without stealing the other side's dignity. Oftentimes in medicine, I do think that there's ways to find a win-win. It takes creativity and it takes a lot, but when you have to get down and dirty, you have to be prepared, you have to be ready for the fight, and you have to do the best you can to do that without stealing the other side's dignity, in my opinion. And there's ways to do that, but it would be a whole other talk. I think there's one over here, one there.
Motion that comes
Yeah.
to mind for me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't included in your
Yeah,
four other.
You know what's funny is that I give so many talks to non-healthcare providers and they don't get the anger that I sometimes leave it out because it ends up making them angry towards doctors who get angry about being sued. But you're 100% right. And it is well-founded anger. You know, especially if you understand that statistic that says that there is no correlation between negligence and lawsuits, that's a major problem. It's a major problem because good doctors are getting sued, and it's also a major problem because bad doctors aren't getting sued. But I think that the anger is inherent in what happens, and ideally, you have people you can talk to about it. You know, because I have a psychology degree, I do think that I take my role as counselor very seriously with my clients. And I know for sure that they're more vulnerable with me than they are with other people. But that's not always the case. You might have an attorney who's more warrior than, you know, touchy-feely like I am. And if that's the case, then you've got to find someone to talk to, whether that be another doctor. A lot of times your insurance policies will allow for someone for you to talk to, depending on your insurance policy. But that anger is an important thing to recognize and then burn through. Because here's a story that I have time for. This is why I leave time. I had a doctor who was so angry when he would get sued that when it came time for deposition, he would want to attack the plaintiff's attorney. And this was a guy that I knew well, and I knew that he was charismatic and great, and that a jury would love him. But I also knew that they wouldn't love him the way that he was with the plaintiff's attorney. And part of lawsuits is what kind of a reputation you get. Because if plaintiff's attorneys in Philadelphia know that you're angry and nasty and that you don't get deposed well because of those emotions, I believe, this is my Heather Hanson's opinion, you're more likely to get sued again. Because they see that you're going to make a bad witness. And so much of this is about that. So I had said to this doctor after 2 depositions where he got mad and went after the plaintiff's attorney, try it my way. Just try it my way. And he did. And he was so charming, which he's so capable of being. That case happened to be dropped. I'm not saying it was because he was charming, but gosh, did it help me with my argument with him. And he hasn't been sued since. And again, not saying because of that, but I do think that anger doesn't serve you. So when you're angry, which you are, use that anger to fuel your advocacy for yourself. You didn't see anger in those C's. You want to be your own best advocate in front of the jury at your deposition every step of the way. And that means that you've got to find a way to talk about that anger, get that anger out, but not let it be part of the advocacy process. Somebody else had a question? Oh, yeah.
Very quickly, if we have a connection with our patient and, for example, perhaps the result, it isn't as positive as we had hoped, are we allowed to use the words, "I'm sorry"?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I would always highly recommend that you talk to your risk managers. Yes, you can use the words, "I'm sorry" in Pennsylvania. But you need to talk to your risk managers to make sure that that's being said the way that it needs to be said and documented the way that it needs to be documented. Listen, if I wasn't an attorney, I would always tell you to say "I'm sorry." Because I think that serves everybody. It makes the patient, and especially if it's credible, if it's a credible "I'm sorry" and a compassionate "I'm sorry," because it makes the patient feel better and then they might be less likely to sue you. There's all kinds of studies that show that if you have those conversations, patients are less likely to sue. But also, juries like that. Juries like that. I had a case, it wasn't my case, it was my best friend who was also my roommate, also a medical malpractice case, where the doctor had allegedly failed to diagnose cancer. And during the time of the treatment, he wrote the patient a letter saying, "I am so sorry that I missed this diagnosis." But it turned out he hadn't missed it. When we had experts, or they had experts look at the case, the experts said it wasn't there. And it's the whole growth of cancer thing that gets complicated, and I don't have the curse of knowledge about that stuff. So ultimately, the doctor had said, "I'm sorry," and taken on responsibility for missing it when he was wrong. And the plaintiff's attorney was one of those notorious Philly plaintiff's attorneys who was really excited to show the letter to the jury. And the defense attorney fought to get it out, which I was always like, eh. Ultimately, it got into the jury. They loved the doctor, they believed the experts, and they found for the defense. But they loved the doctor because he apologized, because he was human. And it's hard, and that's why I highly, highly stress, you've got some fabulous risk managers in this room. Take advantage of their knowledge. They know what they're doing, and they can help you to put it together in such a package that it's going to help you as best as possible. Anybody else? All right, guys, thank you very much.